Hello, everyone. We have a very interesting time travel for you this evening at the Climate Emergency Centre Wednesday webinar. One of our old friends we met back in the 90s, Chris Church, whose latest incarnation is the oral history of the environmental movement. But Chris has been a long-term campaigner with a lot of different groups and over the years, and is coming to tell us about the 50 years of history of the movement and the oral history project they've got. Originally met him in the 90s, though. He was working with UNED UK, I think, United Nations, and gave us a big compliment about the work we were doing at the Rainbow Centre back in 92. We're on the cutting edge. So without too much further ado, over to you, Chris. Thank you very much for coming. Over.
Okay, good evening. Nice to see lots of people, and one or two people I haven't seen for quite a while, so it's nice to see you. And yeah, I'm going to be showing a fair number of slides because quite a lot of it's pictures of what we've done. I've worked in the sector for quite a while with different organisations like Phoenix Says, and about 10 years ago, me and a mate, Jeremy Isles, who ran the Federation of City Farms, started thinking that there was an awful lot of good stories around the movement that were vanishing with history. And in some cases, people were passing away and we were losing it. And it took us a while to get to a point where we thought, okay, can we develop some kind of history? We talked about doing a map, but we met people who said, oh, you should do this as an oral history project, get people to tell you their stories. And we were fortunate that we found the right university. So Jeremy and I are suddenly linked in to Royal Holloway University, London. And we've been working on a 3-year project. The core of it is to do life story interviews. These are long 4 or 8-hour interviews with 100 people. Choosing them was quite a tricky thing. We're still working on that a bit. We had a list of 300 or 400 who we could have chosen. And I'll come back to that later. But first, I want to talk a little bit about where we as a movement came from. So I'm going to show some slides, and I'm going to go back in time to about 1970, and maybe even a little bit before that. And why I'm starting there will hopefully become clear. And I hope everyone can see those slides. 50 years of environmental action. What have we achieved? What have we actually succeeded in doing? What have we done? What have we learned? So let's start at the beginning. Where's it gone? Next slide, please. There you go. Yeah. We're going to start around about 1970. Partly because of that. Right through the 60s, people were really worried, increasingly worried about pollution. There was radioactive pollution because the Russians, the British, the French, and the Americans were all letting off nuclear bombs in the atmosphere, testing. And we were all getting dosed with radioactive iodine and other things. There was the thalidomide scandal, thousands of children born with serious deformities because their mothers were given drugs during pregnancy. Some of you will have read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which was the first book to challenge the pesticide industry and all sorts of other stuff. And then in 1968, the Torrey Canyon super tanker, ran aground and spilled over 1 million litres of crude oil which ended up on the beaches of Devon and Cornwall. It wasn't the first big pollution spill, but it was the first one that really got on the TV news. And it got a lot of people upset. At the same time, that image was making people realise that we are actually one small blue marble bowling ball, as Joni Mitchell said, in a very dark space, and life is quite precious. And all this, there was other stuff, a lot of it coming together, and the fuses, if you like, were lit. And then in April 1970, there was a guy called Dennis Hayes who got asked to organise a set of university teach-ins on the environment in April 1970. And literally around 20 million people in America turned out. It was fairly phenomenal. That's New York, Fifth Avenue. Suddenly there was an environmental movement in America. and it spread. People were saying, we care not just about individual species, not just about where we live, but about the planet. So where do we in Britain come from? Well, I'm going to suggest that some of it's down to that guy. He was David Brower. He was director of an American conservation group, the Sierra Club, very worried about mountains and wildlife. He left because their board refused to oppose a nuclear power plant that was going to be built on an earthquake zone in California. He set up a whole new organization, Friends of the Earth, specifically to take a more political and more campaigning focus. And within a few months, people in America, in the UK had made contact and had set up their own version. It was only one of several organizations emerging around that time. But Friends of the Earth took up, we want to get out there and campaign. And some of you may be aware of their first big event. This may look a bit weird, but up until 1970, anyone old might remember, you could collect empty bottles, take them back to a corner shop and get a penny or threepence for them. And if you were a kid, that was a useful way of making some extra money. The government said, oh no, that's inconvenient. We're going to throw away all the glass bottles. Bear in mind, there was no glass recycling at that time. Friends of the Earth staff, volunteers collected hundreds of bottles, took them along to Schweppes office and dumped them outside the front door. And it was a kind of, no one had done anything quite like that at that point. And it kind of made people aware that there were different ways to get your viewpoints across. It was a very kind of peaceful process, but it got pictures all over national press, partly because most people recognized that simply throwing away glass bottles that previously had value was a pretty dumb thing to do. But other people were emerging. And the big campaign, really from the 70s, that came along very fast was Save the Whale. It was WWF, it was Friends of the Earth, it was Greenpeace, of course, confronting the whalers, it was Sea Shepherd, all sorts of organisations coming together. And at the point that time, there was a real risk that the blue whale, the sperm whale, many of the others were going to go extinct. And in a way, the first great victory of the movement was getting to the point where the International Whaling Commission said, okay, we want a moratorium. We know Norway and Japan are still taking some, but the risk of extinction from hunting has gone. And yeah, it came up in lots of ways. There's David Bowie balanced on a harpoon doing a benefit for Friends of the Earth. There's people at the International Whaling Commission off the beach of Brighton. All sorts of camp. And again, we're seeing that people actually had fun. This wasn't just serious political campaigning. This was actually people going out and doing slightly silly things, like pretending to be King Neptune wearing a snorkel. So yeah, the movement grew throughout the 70s. And all across Britain, people thought, we want to be involved. Friends of the Earth had no real intention at the start of having local groups. But people kept writing saying, oh, we've formed Liverpool Friends of the Earth, or we've formed Newcastle Friends of the Earth. Suddenly they had a network. And that led to all sorts of other stuff because people started doing local campaigns and saying, we want to save our own area. And other issues came in. This was a very early demonstration at the Motor Show in 1973. Some of those slogans are kind of still with us. Fortunately, we've got rid of lead in petrol down the front there, but that whole issue about space for bikes, space for pedestrians has been with us. We haven't really wrapped that one up yet. And of course, it got into popular culture. The appalling or wonderful, depending on who you talk to, TV series The Good Life, all about very middle-class people trying to go self-sufficient in Surbiton, showed that actually this stuff had got into mainstream. Other people might remember a series called Doomwatch, which ran for 4 series about an agency rather like Greenpeace, trying to challenge pollution and corporate cover-ups. The movement got moving. And yeah, it's worth just going sideways for a minute, because in 75, Friends of the Earth adopted some principles that a lot of environmental organisations still use. Not backing any one political party, actually preventing stuff rather than trying to solve problems, working on what you're working on, and arguing from information rather than, let's not just say rather than ideals, but just ideals, using hard-based information. And all the time, there was the focus on pollution. Pollution legislation in the 70s was pretty rubbish. And it came up in all sorts of ways. But one of the big things that really mobilized in the early days was nuclear power. And this was particularly interesting, probably for a lot of the groups here, because while you had groups like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace doing it, the people who were challenging at the sites, and in this case it was Torness, 20 miles southeast of Edinburgh on the coast, where there was a plan for a nuclear power station. And the local organisers built the Torness Alliance across the UK. Totally new groups in many cases, some of them established, and they formed this very loose alliance. And in doing so, they moved away from what people like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth were doing in terms of focusing on Westminster, but focusing on specific sites. And in May 79, they called an occupation of the Torness site. If anyone wants to look at it, there's a great video. If you Google Torness occupation video, some of it looks quite like what goes on at site protests now. And it was interesting because a lot of it was organised by people who our project almost think of as outsiders. The insiders were the people looking to get the levers of power. The outsiders were the people saying, no, we're going to do it our way. And that tension between the people working towards the centre and the people working on the edges and innovating has, I think, been something that's really helped drive the environmental movement, because it's been quite a creative tension. Some of the people in significant passes, some of you may know a guy called Josh Garman, who founded Plain Stupid and did a lot of the Heathrow action. He's now director of the European Climate Foundation. So you could argue he's moved from outside to inside. But clearly people like that are still there and still very sympathetic to radical action. And Torness was interesting because a lot of the direct action there was supported by some American non-violent direct action trainers who came over. Some of those people at Torness helped set up peace camps under CND 4 years later, and some of that headed off for the roads protests and ended up with the Dongas and Twyford Down. So 79 was almost the high point for what I'd call the first wave. 5,000 or 8,000, depending as to who you believe, got to Torness. I mean, 70 people got on a coach in Oxford, travelled overnight on a Thursday, travelled back overnight on a Sunday. I don't think we'd get that now. It's interesting. 25,000 people rallied in Trafalgar Square 2 months later about Wales. And 7,000 cyclists turned up around Trafalgar Square, one of the first before even critical mass was thought of, and paralysed London by simply cycling round and round Whitehall, and it was great. But it didn't quite last, because 1980s, Thatcher arrived, and with Thatcher came cruise missiles, nuclear warheads based in the UK on cruise missiles. And that was where the Greenham protest and much else came from. It was not a good time in some ways for the environmental movement, because an awful lot of people who'd been in environmental groups were suddenly in peace groups and finding there was plenty to do there. And as it said here, some parts of CND thought, oh, well, atoms for peace are a good thing. But that dip didn't last because there was quite a lot of stuff happened. We were burning an awful lot of coal in power stations that had very little in the way of filters. People may have forgotten acid rain, but all across Germany and Scandinavia, forests were dying due to airborne pollution, and a lot of it coming from British coal-fired power stations. Germany was doing its own as well, of course. And that was a vigorous campaign. Local people wanting to defend their own woodlands from acid rain, while also focusing on coal-fired power stations. First, I think, ever demonstrations at a coal-fired station at Didcot in 1984. And pesticides. People with Rachel Carson, as I said, had written The Silent Spring about pesticides 10 years before. But it took a long while for a campaign to come along. And local organisations started collecting stuff from local papers about pesticide spraying incidents, because at that point, there was very little control. And that's been a long-going campaign. Lead in petrol. It's astonishing to think that for years we put petrol in lead in petrol, theoretically to make engines run more smoothly. And this was interesting because it brought together people from public health and environmental campaigners, gathering evidence, challenging with vested interests. The fossil fuel companies all thought lead in petrol was a great idea, as did a lot of the car manufacturers. It took a while, but the evidence was very, very clear that this was bad for our IQ, very bad for children, and the medical profession stepped up. And lead in petrol was phased out on a precautionary basis. Since then, it's become really clear. The question there in 2007, why did we do it so long? Again, the answer was the vested interests. Just one interesting point. This is the graph of lead in children's blood on the left, and same in America. The red lines are lead levels, the blue levels are crime. Now, no one really knows if falling levels of crime were down to the fact that people weren't getting so brain damaged, but it's an interesting point. There's plenty of other stuff from that time. I'm just going to briefly detail where I came in. Oxford Friends of the Earth, I'm based in Oxford. We campaigned to stop the M40 going across a wetland just northeast of Oxford called Otmore. The motorway was due to plough straight across that land that you can see there. We bought a field and sold it, split it into 2 metre by 1 metre chunks and sold it on all over the world. We know that someone in New Guinea bought a plot, someone in Bhutan. The idea was that if it ever came to compulsory purchase, it would be almost impossible.
Wow, you actually did that. That was talked about, but I never knew it actually been done. Brilliant.
Yeah, the field is still there. It's looked after by Fencott Parish Council. People occasionally go and picnic on it. And if you look at the map of the M40, you will see it does a big backward curve as it goes northeast of Oxford. And that was, Oxford. Just down on the left, that's the kind of document that people got if they sent their £6, I think it was, and they got a tiny little square of a field. Again, a lot of it wasn't just me, a whole bunch of people all over the country have always been doing interesting stuff. And yeah, we're particularly pleased because a lot of that land is now an RSPB nature reserve. End of personal story. But yeah, there's a famous quote, not necessarily from Gandhi, about first they ignore you, and that's what happened in the early 70s. Then they laugh at you with a good life. Then they fight you. And this was the tragic moment when French government agencies blew the Greenpeace boat up in New Zealand. Very bad move by the French government, huge publicity, huge boost for Greenpeace, and it kind of set the scene for a whole bunch of other big steps, some of which were nothing to do with us. Notably, of course, April 1986, Chernobyl blew up. Radioactive cloud across Sweden, Scandinavia. The initial thought was that something had gone wrong in Sweden, and then it became clear that the cloud had come all the way from Russia. And I don't know if there's anyone here who's been involved as long, but for about 2 or 3 weeks then, it was massive news. Sheep farming in Wales was badly affected because it rained heavily and put an awful lot of radioactive iodine into the ground, which came out through grass and heather, so the sheep couldn't be sold for food. People were really terrified about what was happening to their children. The health impacts here are probably fairly small, but in Belarus and parts of Russia, it was a disaster. And it's worth remembering that a month before this, the government's energy minister under Margaret Thatcher had gone publicly and stated nuclear power is the safest form of energy known to humanity. So never make stupid statements like that. And meanwhile, government was trying to work out what to do with low-level nuclear waste. There were some of the strongest ever local grassroots campaigns. This was actually in Lincolnshire, a small village called Fulbeck. There were other campaigns in Bedfordshire and Hull, where literally whole villages turned up and said no. And the government abandoned plans for low-level nuclear waste, so it's all still sitting at Sellafield. And again, the other big one, the hole in the ozone layer. The idea that the ozone layer was falling apart and we were all being exposed to higher levels of ultraviolet radiation and skin cancer was seriously worrying. And this was one point where NGOs all over the world acted and governments responded. It was an early consumer campaign. Organisations, people could work out very easily which aerosols they were buying, if they were buying aerosols, had CFCs in and which ones didn't. The Montreal Protocol, possibly the most important international agreement, because CFCs, which were causing the ozone layer hole, are also, of course, massively dangerous greenhouse gases. So the other thing, we started to see more and more pictures like this of the Amazon in flames. The whole number of local environmental groups across Britain kind of doubled in 2 years as people responded. And it finally got to her. Margaret Thatcher made her environmental speech in 1988, where she claimed they weren't just friends of the earth. And she was briefed on climate change by a guy called Sir Crispin Tickell, who was a government scientist, who convinced her that she, as a scientist, had to understand the science. Which brings us to 89, and I'm not going to go into quite so much detail in the next years, but I think the roots are interesting. Because in 1989, in European elections, the Green Party got 15% of the vote, rather more than they've had in elections since. And of course, at that point, the elections weren't being run on proportional representation, so they didn't get seats. The next European election they did, and of course, people like Jean Lambert and Caroline Lucas stepped up. But that was of the peak. It translated into a widening world and international action. The big one was the Rio Earth Summit. Huge event in Rio de Janeiro, a lot of NGOs active around the edges, and it gave us the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Framework Agreement on Climate, very, very weak, but it was a start. Similarly, a Convention on Biodiversity. It also triggered all sorts of other stuff. It all kind of started to go mainstream. You'll probably find the Green Consumer Guide in second-hand bookshops, but at one point it was top of the bestseller list. And things like Earth Hour happened. And other stuff happened as well, of course. It wasn't just mainstream. This was the point, at which the government's road programme finally got challenged. Twyford Down kicked it off. The M11, that picture on the left. Dan Hooper, aka Swampy. Interestingly, Friends of the Earth joined after staying out of the protests for a couple of years, joined the march at Twyford Down. The rather macho person there is now Tony Juniper, who's now the chair of Natural England. So he's been on a journey. But and again, the signs defending the right to peaceful protest, because the government brought in legislation then to try and stem the protests, just as they've done in recent years. But we had all sorts of local campaigns. We had high-profile campaigns like that. Meanwhile, we started to see things like that. We'd been talking about the need for clean energy for 15 years. Finally, Britain got some of its first wind farms. And things moved forward. By 1999, we had a new government, the Labour government. The roads programme died on its feet and was cancelled. Recycling had been pushed by local groups for many years, by environmental groups. It really only became law in 2003. So yeah, it all moved forward. We I'm going to go a little faster now because time is ticking. We continued. This was the big push by lots of organisations for a climate act, which we got in 2008 after the Big Ask campaign. People going global, tackling oil pollution and fossil fuel companies all over the world. And it got very local. There was all that stuff about reusable bags, 50 ways to green your home. A lot of this did come from the environmental movement, but it was hugely promoted in some cases by organisations like BP, who figured they could use this to put the blame on people rather than take the blame themselves. And by this time, it was becoming very clear that the fossil fuel industry had known about climate change for many years. We did get the Climate Act, and that's perhaps the fourth wave. I won't go into detail, but this stuff does come in waves. And a couple of years after that, there was climate denial back again, but we got there. And in 2015, we got the Paris Agreement, which at the time seemed like a huge step forward, and it was, even if most of the governments whose leaders are in that picture have not lived up to their promises. But it's there. And of course, new campaigns have emerged. The fossil fuel industry has become the major target, as climate has become the Uber campaign. I haven't talked about all the successes on wildlife and stuff. There's so much more one could talk about. And with that, there was the other big one, fracking, where community action, NGOs, radical groups all came together to say, we're not having it. And so far, we haven't. And then, of course, the next wave arrived. Greta, XR, school strikes. Suddenly, climate is back big time. And we got the Climate Act of 2008 upgraded. But we started to see serious delaying, and the Conservative government of the time, who did support the cross-party alliance that said we need net zero, did very little to actually make it happen. But that's kind of where we are. We're after the last peak. And I don't know about you, but I think a lot of people are quite exhausted, run down, depressed. It's not a good time. And I think if we are going to keep going, and we had to do this in previous dips of support, we need to keep going and reconnect between ourselves and reconnect with all those people out there who are scared and worried, but don't necessarily do anything. So that's a romp through the early days and a little bit of history. But I'm going to talk about what we're doing for just a few minutes on the project. We're interviewing people to make sure that those stories get told. We want to really bring in the diverse and unsung stories. All those interviews will be recorded and be part of the British Library, National Sound Archive. We'll be doing a book, and we're doing educational resources. And here's some questions which you might want to think about. How does an archive actually enrich our collective memory? What motivates us? One of the things we're really looking at is what got people involved in the first place and what sustains people, what keeps people going. What can those stories tell us about change, and how has it changed? Some of the same slogans are still there, but we've got some very different issues. big question. Over these years, we've won a lot, but are we losing the war? You could argue that there is real progress being made as we decarbonise, but it's nowhere near fast enough. We need to keep going. And yeah, can we get more persuasive? Can we actually get a working majority for real change? Can we pass the laws that will help? The government is meant to produce its new climate plan by May, after being told by the Supreme Court last year that the current plan was wholly inadequate. And can we make the changes that are needed? I'm sure we've all come across people who don't want electric cars, don't want heat pumps, partly because they're all strange and new. But we've been through a lot of change over the last 50 years. And a lot of us who are working on it are agents for change. And I think we need to continue being those people. So we've asked ourselves also, what is the environmental movement? We split this into 6 major issues: climate and energy, nature and landscape, transport. We had to find ways to cut the cake because we had to work out who we were going to interview. 6 issues and 5 decades. People across all 5 decades. We've interviewed teenagers as well as people in their 80s. We've worked across 4 nations: England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland. And we've also said, okay, a lot of this has been about protest. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call have been involved in protests. But it's also about the projects, the city farms, the eco centres, the community energy projects, the cycleways. All that's part of the movement as well. And in the background, there's the people pushing the policy stuff. And it all fuels itself. You know, all these things go round and round. So for us, we could have gone on forever, but we only doing 100 interviews. We had money from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but we had to be careful about how it's spent. So what do you think? Is it useful? You know, there have been such huge changes. Is there little to learn from the early days? How does looking back help looking forward? And one of the issues that we've dug in a bit on is how we have failed to tackle diversity. We're still pretty weak. We're better than we were, but there were an awful lot of initiatives that never really got us outside our core middle class white kind of grouping. There's a lot to be done. And we're looking at all these, and we hope that what we're going to do is going to be helpful. So that's me. That's some of the history. But I will say, there's been some good local histories done. They've done one for Bristol's environmental movement. Other people are talking about it. If anyone wants to do this kind of thing, we'd be happy to talk. We're running for another few months and then we're out of money, and we'll have a book and the interviews will be online. So that's where we are. I'm continuing to campaign locally, but it's been absolutely fascinating. Our website, which I will put in the chat, has a really interesting blog from a young researcher working with us. She's been out and interviewed 30 or so people and said it was absolutely fascinating. Old people, young people, they all had that look in their eye that said, we are doing something, we are wanting to change. And I think it's really interesting to see how the movement has changed, but the driving force behind people is still strong. So,
Brilliant.
take some questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was absolutely incredible time travel. And it's great to see the prehistory. Our particular group got active around the Rio Earth Summit, I think, when we originally met you, and Twyford Down and things. So the Climate Emergency Centres, you could say, is a product of those days, and the centres back in the 90s. So, folks, if you've got a question, a comment, a feedback for Chris, it helps with the facilitating if you stick a hand up there. Quick off the mark, Norfolk team, Genji, go for it. Down at the bottom, you can raise or lower a
You're
hand.
muted, Genji.
Okay, yeah, ask to unmute. There we go. I think you have to
Still
unmute on your.
muted.
Oh, yeah,
There
there
you
we
go.
go. It's done. God, cheers so much, Chris. Appreciation. I guess a couple of things. One, I would say this, but I'm really interested in culture change, Chris.
Yeah.
You know, like the water we swim in and how, you know, how we actually see the world and how that changes, you know, over the period of history. So not just kind of, yeah, I hear you talking about projects, you know, for example, permaculture and, you know, and I would say that is part of like culture change, you know, how we actually see the world, what matters to us.
That's something that I hope will come out in the book we're writing. We're not just doing a straight history. We're going to be looking in different chapters on how people got involved, what sustained them, and culture is an important part of that. We've been running some small group seminars. We had one a couple of weeks ago on the sound of protest, which included like people from the climate choir, as well as a guy who runs a record company, but who ran No Nukes music in the 80s. So we've been trying to dig out a wide range of people. And I think the cultural stuff, you know, we've gone to small Scottish islands and we've gone to central London. So we've done what we can. Let me just answer Diana's question about war needing to be linked in. We had to, in the chat, sorry, Ruth, I'll come to you in a sec, but we had to draw some boundaries. We said we weren't going to talk to people in government, though we've done Caroline Lucas and Zach Goldsmith. But by and large, we've wanted to go to people who are definitely in the movement. But the peace movement has been really well chronicled. So we felt, okay, we're going to look at the overlap there, but we're not going to do that. You will find plenty of good oral history of the peace movement. So Ruth.
Unmute there.
Hi, thank you so much. It was really fantastic. I think one of the values of this is for just to strengthen us personally and emotionally to like feel our own history is quite important. I didn't see Climate Camp. Maybe it flew by and I missed it, but it was quite a major thing, and also Reclaim the Power, which really I don't know why we didn't just call it Climate Camp again, because it was Climate Camp and led by, you know, a lot of people from Climate Camp. But those two were so important in founding a lot of what happened afterwards, and a whole education for a generation or two of people. And when Climate Camp was folding, one of the reasons was that people were wanting to get more involved in austerity issues, which was coming up at that time. And in your questions, you asked, what can we do to make it more diverse, but also more popular? And I think a lot of that has to do with actually linking people's economic survival with environmental issues, which a lot of the first things did. You know, the things that you showed at the beginning did do that, but a lot of things don't do it. And I'm hands up, I'm from Fuel Poverty Action, which we founded at Climate Camp, began it precisely in order to deal with standard of living, cost of living at the same time as the environment.
I think there is a really important link. The links with social issues. I mean, I couldn't cover everything, and I figured the last 10 years a lot of people on this call would know about. So that, I mean, I could have talked at great length about, as you say, Climate Camp, all the big protests. But yeah, one of the challenges is how, I mean, in some cases, people want what I call a grand unified theory of everything, which is quite difficult to deliver, partly because it suggests that the only way to tackle climate change is to tackle capitalism. And while that may be true, we've not been very, following on Karl Marx in 1870, we've not made great progress. And I think, you know, you have to decide where you want to put your efforts. But yeah, the social links are really important. Fran, You had
The
a
trouble is,
question.
if you don't make that connection, then you end up with reform making that connection for
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. But Fran, do you want to come on?
Yeah, Fran, then Jen. Chris has got till 8 o'clock, just on timelines, guys. Fran, you have to unmute, I think.
Or maybe Jen.
Yeah,
Hello, first, Fran. Yeah.
yeah, sorry, took me a minute to unmute. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. That's really interesting. I was wondering, because you've mentioned a few things where there's clearly a lot of repetition, like you mentioned people feeling they had to go and focus on anti-war issues rather than environmental at the start of the cruise missile era, which then happened again in 2001. And you also mentioned repression and the Criminal Justice Act, which obviously we've seen a lot of that more recently with repressive legislation coming through. And I was wondering just whether you've had any insights from all those interviews about what we can constructively do with that repetition, because it's felt to me recently like as a I wasn't involved in the Criminal Justice Act protests, but I was kind of on the edge of it as a teenager, and it felt like this really vibrant, exciting thing. And I feel like we haven't, like we've had incredible resistance to the several repressive bills we've had in the last few years, but we're so much more on the back foot. And I was just wondering whether you've got any insight about that, or wisdom from the mass of people you've spoken to.
Yeah.
So that's not a very good question.
No, it's an interesting point. I mean, at the moment, we're at a point where we've done an awful lot of interviews. We haven't analysed them in detail. We have a rough idea of the kind of issues we're going to be covering in the book. As I say, a lot of that is how people respond to pressure. And the pressures from repressive legislation, hostility, and so on are important. I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers, but I think these things do come round. And I think it is important that people think, okay, it's different now, but maybe there's something to think about, to learn from. And I think it's actually just some cases pausing to reflect and look for support from not just from our history, but from other social movements as well.
Okay.
Jen,
Go for
you've got a question. Jen P. Again, unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I was surprised, shocked even, Chris, that you didn't mention a fantastic action that Friends of the Earth organised in the year 2000. They mobilised all the local groups in the UK and around Europe and beyond, and we all went to the 2006 climate conference in The Hague, and I'm still talking about it today. And if you remember, I don't know if you came along on that, but we built a massive great wall around the conference centre, symbolically of sandbags. And I've still got wonderful pictures of the police, would you believe it, holding out the bags for us to fill with sand. And it was just fantastic. It was wonderful. So when people start talking about COP, to me, I say, don't talk to me about COP.
No, it was a brilliant action, and I feel honoured to have been there as well. I couldn't talk about them all. There are so many.
I know.
I mean, pretty much every few years there's been some event that really kind of electrifies people. And I think, we will be developing a timeline, which will be online so that people can go back, and hopefully we'll have a way in which people can maybe feed in photos and stories.
But you see, since then, I've been involved in all kinds of things with Friends of the Earth. I mean, we had a fantastic several anti-incineration campaigns in Norfolk. We also launched Zero Waste in connection with Greenpeace, and we've done some fantastic things. But I have to say, in the latter part of 2018, when XR came along, I jumped ship because I thought, I'm not going to any more council meetings. I'm not signing any more petitions. I'm absolutely up to here.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's it. We all make journeys in all sorts of different ways. Toby Gale, long time no see. Nice.
I'm going to keep the timekeeping going along here, both for Chris and everyone. We've got 8 o'clock. Chris has got to go. Toby, then Zoe, Raga. Go for it, Toby. You have to unmute.
Yeah, you're on. I can hear you.
Okay. Is there something in the characterization that we, through to sort of the early 2000s, we were really trying to get the system to change? And then since then, we've progressively realizing that the system isn't going to change, can't change itself. The system is part of the problem. I wonder what you've picked up, Chris, that whether you'd say that what you've picked up aligns with that, and whether you've got any reflections on that as a sort of shift in how the environmental movement in sort of tactics, in alliances, in strategy. Yeah, I mean,
no, it's an interesting point.
Any reflections on it?
I mean, I mentioned earlier the difference between the insiders and outsiders as being one tension, the people who want to work with Parliament or people who want to work way outside it. I think that's always been there. And I think one of the things that got the environmental movement going in the 70s was quite a vibrant counterculture, radical, I won't say, you know, related to some of the drugs that were going around in those days, but I can see Shane Collins smiling. There was a really strong system change, not, climate change, even in those days. I think there was an issue. I think it's come and gone. And as you say, when you had Occupy, you had the anti-globalization stuff. It's been interesting how that has slipped away. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, in a way, the fact that climate has become such an immediate issue, I don't have any easy answers. Maybe in 6 months' time when we've done a bit more of the analysis. But I think everyone's got their own answers on this. And I think we need some innovation at the moment. And I'm not necessarily the person to provide it.
Just to say, we are going to...
I've got time for about 3 more questions, I think.
Keep it succinct, folks, both questioners and Chris's replies. So Zoe, go for it. And we will stay around for a chat afterwards if you unmute, Zoe. If Chris has to go at 8 still.
If anyone wants to stay around, I'm going to put my colleague Barbara Brachet, who's also on the project, who's actually in the audience, if she might even want to take some questions after I've gone.
Great.
Can Raga ask a question now?
Well, Zoe's next in the queue, and then Raga, then Shane.
You said that she was after the last person. And
I didn't know if Raga wants to go now.
Go for it, Raga.
Should I go for it? Okay. What we need is more ridiculousness. Juicy, outrageous, take your knickers down and put them on a flagpole. We need more of that, and we need to be daring and loving and weeping. All our emotions need to come out, and we need to be. It's something beyond belief that we are so stupid, and we've got to send ourselves up in all kinds of wonderful, ridiculous, naughty, wicked ways. Bless us all.
Okay. I mean, humor has been an essential part of this all the way through. And how we balance the humor and the seriousness when we're facing an existential crisis is something we all have to work through. But Zoe, I think you've got to the front. You're muted.
Yep, I've been allowed to unmute. I don't know how to follow Raga. That was absolutely agree. I wanted to say I'm going to follow on the previous comment about insider outsider and about sort of radical and sponsored by capitalist surplus different approaches to environmentalism. And in my experience, you need both really, and they can each service the other and encourage and support the other and not be the other. But also, and more specifically, as some people here I know are aware, the undercover policing inquiry is underway at the moment, and it's going to kick off again on the 13th of October is the latest date for the next tranche of hearings, which is basically going to be looking at the 90s and the noughties. And that is going to be looking a lot at what undercover police were up to within the environment movement, the peace movement, various, including talking about taking the piss, the clandestine insurgent rebel clown army, which was spied on from within by a state operative on overtime. And
we've
so
talked to quite a few people.
Other perspective on the history of our movements when you are beginning to be aware of what they were up to, and get involved with people who are part of that, because you can actually put in questions. There may be questions emerging from your research which might be kind of valuable to be answered in the inquiry. So
okay, I'll take that on board, certainly. And I know Saskia, one of our researchers, has spoken to several of the people involved in Spike Ops. Shane, brilliant. I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes, I'm afraid. It looks like you might be for
3 minutes. Shane and Chris, go for it.
All right, I'll be really quick. Chris, fascinating and really, good to see, especially the 80s, which I wasn't so familiar with. And good, you mentioned the victories, the road protests and fracking. I don't know if I missed the other victories, which were stopping GM food, and maybe the major one, which has caused Britain's drop in CO2 emissions, other than outsourcing manufacturing to China, but was in 2008 stopping Labour's new round of 11 coal-fired power stations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I should have mentioned that. I mean, I think the campaign against coal, we talked to people who really, at Greenpeace and others, who really thought they weren't going to get anywhere. And suddenly, 3 years later, they'd won. I mean, Kingsnorth was a real turning point, I think.
Wasn't it? Yes. Yeah. And that led Miliband to say there could only be new coal-fired power stations if there were 25% carbon capture and storage, which, of course, put the kibosh on the whole thing. But the other point I wanted to make is that, we failed on 1.5. We have a very steeply declining window to keep below 2.
Yeah.
The Institute of Actuaries and University of Exeter, Tim Lenton, put out a report last week on planet solvency. And one of the things they did was a grid matrix on what would happen to global GDP and global population at 1.5, 2, and 3 by 2050. And to me, it was a real wake-up call, because, above 2 degrees by 2050, that's 20% of the population.
Sorry, Shane, I'm going to have to stop you, because I've literally got to walk out the door at 8 o'clock. Otherwise, I'm really late. Christine, I'm sorry, but Barbara, are you there?
Chris, I just want to say, to end it up just there on the thing, thank you very, very much. Just your parting comment there as you've got to beam off, whatever you want to say now, but thank you so much for an amazing time travel and your brilliant project. Over to you for parting comment.
Well, I mean, really, we are still someone said, do you really want to write about history when you should be making it? And I think we have to do both. I think we have to learn from the past, but we've got a really difficult few years ahead. So let's really work together. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're learning from the past and making history and herstory as we go. Thanks very much.